You actually came. I didn't think you would. The words, laced with a sugar-coated condescension that was her signature, hung in the air between us. It was a humid summer afternoon, the kind where the air itself felt thick with unspoken things, and we stood on the manicured lawn of her childhood home, a place that had always felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. My sister, Amelia, had just finished her vows, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, proud parents, beaming bridesmaids, a sea of smiling relatives and acquaintances. And then, her eyes found mine. The laughter, a ripple of polite amusement that had started with the officiant's slightly off-key pronouncement, swelled and then died down, leaving an awkward silence punctuated by the distant chirping of cicadas. It wasn't a cruel laughter, not a mockery, but a collective, almost pitying chuckle. The kind reserved for someone who showed up to a black-tie gala in jeans. I was the only one standing there, with no date, no +1, just me, my carefully chosen dress, and a gift bag that felt ridiculously heavy. My normal, for as long as I could remember, had been a landscape painted in shades of Amelia's overwhelming presence. She was the sun, and I, the moon, perpetually orbiting in her reflected light, often eclipsing my own. Our parents, bless their well-meaning but often blind hearts, had always treated her as the golden child, the one destined for greatness. I was the quiet one, the observer, the one who faded into the background. This dynamic was as ingrained as the chipped paint on the old garden bench where we'd spent countless childhood afternoons, Amelia orchestrating elaborate tea parties with dolls she'd meticulously dressed, and me, dutifully playing the role of the silent attendant. It wasn't overt cruelty, not usually. It was more a subtle, pervasive neglect, a constant implication that my feelings, my accomplishments, my very existence, were secondary. I remembered one particular summer when I'd poured my heart into a school science project, a delicate ecosystem in a jar that had taken weeks to perfect. I'd carefully documented every tiny leaf, every minuscule creature. Amelia, meanwhile, was preparing for her debutante ball. The night before the presentation, while I was carefully placing the final sprig of moss, she'd accidentally knocked over my project, the glass shattering across the floor, the miniature world collapsing into a muddy mess. Her apology was swift, delivered with wide, innocent eyes, and followed by a tearful plea for me to help her find the perfect shade of lipstick for her ball. Our mother had found me crying amongst the shards and said, with a sigh, "Oh, dear. Well, Amelia has so much on her plate. You'll understand." I did understand, in the way one understands that the tide will inevitably come in. Then there was the inheritance. After Grandpa passed, the distribution of his modest estate was handled with a speed that felt almost indecent. Amelia, still in her early 20s, was already talking about her future wedding, her dream house. She'd sat with her lawyer, reviewing the documents, and then called me, not to discuss our shared grandfather's legacy, but to point out, with a triumphant lilt, that she was receiving the larger portion of the cash savings. "It makes sense, doesn't it?" she'd chirped. "You don't really do you? You're not planning anything big." My own dreams, modest as they were, the possibility of further education, of a small down payment on a future modest home, were deemed irrelevant against her perceived grander destiny. The check arrived a week later, less than half of what I'd expected, the difference accounted for by Amelia's needs. I never challenged it. The energy required to fight felt like a battle already lost. So, standing there, in my perfectly respectable dress, as the wedding guests' gazes flickered from Amelia's radiant face to my solitary figure, I felt a familiar sting. The title of the event was Our Joyful Union, and for Amelia, it was, undoubtedly. For me, it was another tableau where I was the periphery, the footnotes in her dazzling narrative. The officiant had finished, the congregation was settling back into their seats, and Amelia, now Mrs. Harrison, was making her way down the aisle with her new husband, their hands clasped. She paused before me, her smile tight, her eyes flicking from my face to the empty space beside me. The question hung unspoken, "Where's your escort, darling?" The laughter, a softer echo now, seemed to follow her. It was a tiny, insignificant detail in the grand scheme of a wedding, but it was a confirmation of my place, or rather, my lack of one, in her carefully curated world. I offered a tight-lipped smile, a nod, and then, as she continued her triumphant procession, I turned and walked away from the reception tent, heading towards the edge of the property, towards the old, gnarled oak tree that had stood scent inel for generations. I sat beneath the oak, the rough bark a grounding contrast to the polished veneer of the wedding. The distant sound of music and conversation drifted on the breeze. My phone buzzed. Texts from my mother, "Where are you? Everyone is asking. Amelia is looking for you." And then, Amelia's own text, stark and demanding, "Get back here. Now. You're making a scene." A scene. Me, the quiet observer, the background noise, was now a disruptive force. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over a name I hadn't dialed in years. It was time. I took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and honeysuckle filling my lungs, and sent a single message, "Meeting with my lawyer. Urgent." I didn't mention whose lawyer. I didn't need to. The next few days were a blur of hushed phone calls and hushed meetings. My parents, predictably, were frantic. Amelia, after her initial outrage, had descended into a state of bewildered fury. The texts were relentless. "What lawyer? What are you talking about? This is a joke, right? Mom's worried sick about you. You're ruining this for everyone." I ignored them all. I let the silence become my response, a growing chasm between her frantic attempts to pull me back into her orbit and my quiet, deliberate steps away. Then came the official notification. It arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope, bearing the insignia of a reputable law firm I'd never heard of until a week prior. It wasn't addressed to me, but to Amelia. It was a formal notice of intent to contest a clause in Grandpa's will, specifically the one concerning the transfer of his share in the family's small, but profitable, lakefront property. A property that, after Amelia's generous settlement, had been solely in her name. The will, I had discovered through my newfound legal representation, contained a specific provision regarding the sentimental value and historical significance of this particular asset, a provision that Amelia, in her haste to consolidate her gains, had overlooked. Or rather, she had dismissed it as a minor detail, something easily negotiated away. I had spent years enduring her subtle jabs, her casual dismissals, her entitlement that felt like a suffocating blanket. The science project, the inheritance, the constant comparisons, the feeling of being perpetually less than. Each incident was a tiny pebble added to a growing pile. The wedding, however, had been the final, impossible weight. The laughter, though not overtly cruel, had been the sound of my invisibility made public. It was the moment I realized that my quiet endurance had been interpreted as weakness, as acceptance. The notification was concise, clinical. It detailed the legal basis for contesting the sole ownership, citing Grandpa's explicit wishes for shared custodianship and outlining the steps Amelia would need to take to address the oversight. It wasn't a demand for retribution, but a simple, irrefutable correction of an injustice. I'd instructed my lawyer to be firm but polite, to present the facts, and to leave no room for emotional manipulation. The satisfaction wasn't in the spectacle, but in the quiet precision of the legal machinery grinding into motion. The real moment of reckoning, the one that etched itself into my memory, was when Amelia's lawyer, a stern woman named Ms. Davies, called me. I sat in my small, tidy apartment, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across my worn rug. Amelia was on speakerphone, her voice a tight wire of barely contained fury. "This is absurd. She can't do this. Grandpa's will was clear." Ms. Davies' voice was calm, unwavering. "Miss Peterson, the will you signed does indeed have a clause that pertains to the lake property. While the asset was transferred to you, the provision for its shared use and preservation was clearly stated. Our client is simply seeking to uphold the spirit and letter of your grandfather's wishes." Amelia sputtered, but I needed that property. "I've already made plans." Ms. Davies paused. "Then I suggest you reevaluate those plans. Our client's position is that the property remains a shared asset, as per the original will. Furthermore, she is requesting a full accounting of all income and expenditures related to the property since the transfer. Amelia's breath hitched. The arrogant certainty in her voice evaporated, replaced by a tremor of panic. An accounting? But I haven't. Her voice trailed off, a strangled gasp. I could picture her face, the smooth, unlined brow furrowed in confusion, the lips parted in disbelief. The smug assurance that had fueled her lifelong entitlement was beginning to crumble, like plaster falling from a decaying wall. Miss Davies continued, her tone unwavering, then that will require investigation. Our client is prepared to pursue all legal avenues to ensure the terms of the will are honored. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of polite contemplation, it was the terrified silence of someone whose foundations were being shaken. Amelia finally whispered, She's doing this because of the wedding? Ms. Davies replied, her voice devoid of emotion, our client's actions are based on legal precedent and the documented intentions of your grandfather. The connection clicked off. Amelia was left with the chilling echo of my resolve. The fallout was predictable, a tempest in a teacup that quickly spilled over. My mother called, her voice cracking with distress. Amelia is hysterical. She's saying you're trying to ruin her. You have to call her, darling, you have to fix this. My father was more measured, but the underlying message was the same, this is creating a lot of unpleasantness. Is there no way to smooth things over? Amelia's texts escalated from pleading to outright threats, thinly veiled accusations of malicious intent. Then came the flying monkeys, cousins, aunts, family friends, all armed with Amelia's curated version of events, all ready to deliver their pronouncements of my supposed wickedness. How could you do this to your sister? She's so heartbroken. Don't you care about family unity? I answered none of them. I let their words bounce off me, like pebbles against armor. Amelia's world, built on a foundation of perceived superiority and effortless acquisition, began to unravel. The legal process was slow but relentless. The shared custody of the lake property meant she couldn't unilaterally sell it or develop it as she'd planned. The demand for an accounting forced her to confront years of questionable financial decisions she'd made with what she believed was her sole inheritance. Whispers started. Not the polite wedding laughter, but a different kind of buzz, one of suspicion and hushed judgment. Her carefully crafted image of the successful, benevolent woman began to fray at the edges. She had underestimated the power of quiet persistence, the cold logic of law, and the profound impact of a truth that had been ignored for too long. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic scene where I gloated or reveled in her distress. The satisfaction was far more profound, a deep, quiet settling in my soul. It was in the moments I saw her facade crack, the flicker of panic in her eyes when confronted with facts, the frantic, desperate attempts to regain control that only seemed to tighten the noose. The social consequences were the most satisfying. The whispers turned into pointed looks. The invitations to family gatherings started to dry up, or she found herself seated at the periphery, no longer the center of attention. Her carefully constructed social standing, once so unshakable, began to erode, brick by painstaking brick. I never spoke to Amelia about it again. The legal proceedings concluded with a negotiated settlement that was fair, just, and a stark reminder that entitlement, however deeply ingrained, could not override established rights. I received my rightful share, and the lake property was indeed managed with a respect for Grandpa's wishes. The finality wasn't in Amelia's ruin, but in my own liberation. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but a presence of peace. I had stopped orbiting, and in doing so, had finally found my own sun.